boot camp for developers, Bitcoin developers, and I asked you how many, and you said 7. I immediately thought of those Mercury astronauts. I think there might have been 7 of them, and they were called the Mercury 7. And that was the beginning of the astronaut role in the United States and the beginning of the Apollo space program. And one very visionary president, John F. Kennedy, set the motion, set the tone by saying we will land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. I feel President Bukele, similarly, the JFK meets Steve Jobs of presidents, has made a goal for this country to be absolutely the leader in Bitcoin globally and to make Bitcoin the global standard. And those 7 developers are the beginning. They're going to take this country to the Bitcoin moon.
You know, you said you think there were 7 astronauts. They were called the Mercury 7. So usually it sounds like the name suggests that there were 7. So I'm assuming there were 7.
Well, sometimes I think of the Secaucus 7, which was a political organization at that time near to the Weather Underground. You remember, I'm a child of the 70s, and a lot of what happened during that decade I don't remember.
They said that Morgan Stanley is encouraging their clients to buy these El Salvador bonds because they're trading at 25 cents when they said even if they do default, they should be trading at 43 cents, not 25 cents. But they reckon they're not going to default because they have the money to pay the payment due in January.
Well, no, I was talking to Josue Lopez about this. You know, he's a private equity guy from Switzerland. He's been on our show. And he said, look, the way the private equity crowd is looking at these bonds is at 23, 24 cents on the dollar. It's an easy double. And because the underlying fundamentals in this country are outstanding, and the market is unusually punishing these bonds purely out of spite, purely for political reasons. And so this is where private equity, that's how they become a billionaire. That's why Josue is going to be a billionaire, because he looks at this stuff and he's like, you know what? I want to be a billionaire. I'm going to buy this paper at 23 cents on the dollar. It's going to go to 40, 50, 60 cents on the dollar, and I'm going to have the last laugh. That's how billionaires become billionaires.
So the guy who wrote this for Morgan Stanley, his name is Simon Weaver. He's the global head of emerging market sovereign credit strategy at Morgan Stanley. And he told investors in a Tuesday note that El Salvador's bonds are overly punished by the market conditions, despite the country having better financial metrics than many of its peers, reported Bloomberg. The note to investors read, markets are clearly pricing in a high probability of the autarky scene in which El Salvador defaults, but there's no restructuring. And just so you know out there, autarky means self-sufficiency, independence, specifically national economic self-sufficiency and independence, a policy of establishing a self-sufficient and independent national economy, which kind of sounds like positive, but in fact it means a negative thing in terms of economics, because it's like you're shut off from the rest of the global economy.
I've never seen the word autarky in a financial report, and you're right. When you first see it, you're like, well, that's a positive thing, because they're insulating themselves from the vagaries of these outside markets that seem like they're in chaos. And they have Bitcoin, and they're growing their own GDP organically. They've got the tourism, they've got the forward investment coming in, they've got the infrastructure build out, and they really are. It really is an autarky, but that's in this context, that's not a negative. And I think that's where investors potentially are seeing this. You know what? This is a non-correlated asset, to put it in pure financial terms. When you're investing today in a world dominated by these global central banks who are all in the same trade, they're all on the same side of the same trade, and that is easy money. El Salvador is going against the trend and saying, you know, we can grow organically our own economy. Bitcoin is at the center of it, and we're not exposed to that risk. So if you're trying to get an uncorrelated trade and get pure alpha, pure return, El Salvador is probably the best, most underrated play in the globe today.
Of course, the president, everybody in this country wants more investment in the country. People are investing in this country. He's inviting people into this country. That's what he said in the State of the Union. He wants people to come to this country. That's the opposite of autarky. He doesn't want, he's not closing it off. So they're wrong. Well, Morgan Stanley is telling their clients they're wrong to bet on that. That's not the outcome. But of course, what they're doing is they're reading the wrong newspapers or tuning into the wrong shows on YouTube. They should be tuning into this sort of program rather than Bloomberg, rather than Wall Street Journal. As I said earlier, they have spoken to me but failed to quote me, even though I told them months ago, people could have got in at 25 cents or under 25 cents. Instead, they're going to have to get in at 45, 55, 65 cents instead when these bond payments are made. And there was a recent report out in the past week or so from one of these financial newspapers, and they said that the number one risk of default in the whole entire world is El Salvador. But what this guy from Morgan Stanley says is the Tuesday note assessed that El Salvador shouldn't have any problem repaying debts for the next 12 months because of the primary surplus. Plus, it has smaller maturities coming due than other distressed nations like Argentina, Egypt, and Ukraine. So again, people are listening to the wrong information, and they're going to lose money by listening to the wrong information. But that's what bias does. That's what political bias, cultural bias, any sort of bias is a way to lose money. That's a way to lose money because you get sold a bag of bad investment advice.
Right, markets can remain irrational longer than you have funds. And so having a bias in a market setting can be death to a portfolio performance. And to your point, it's an autarky not by the suggestion of those running the country. The country, as you point out, is opening to the world and saying, come on in and invest. And they're getting a lot of investment from around the world. But it's the perception from people who have that bias. And that's why they're missing the bet. They can't even describe it accurately in a financial paper. And that's where the smart money sees, you know what, there's an arbitrage here between the perception and what's really on the ground. And obviously Salvadorans who are in the money market business, as we've just mentioned, they are salivating at this opportunity, and money's being raised in the billions.
Right. I mean, again, like they don't give agency to the people here, the president here. He himself gets up on stage and says, we're going to be like Singapore. And yet they decide in the mainstream financial press to just report what they themselves say about the country. They're saying like, oh, it's like an autarky. Closed off.
Look, I was a stockbroker in the 80s, very successful. I did .com in the 90s, very successful. I started buying Bitcoin in 2011 at $1, very successful. I'm now in El Salvador. Is that a freaking coincidence? Or am I going to be in the place that I want to be? I want to be in the hot place. I want to be in the hot market. I want to be where the parrots and the torgos are flying around free to be who they are. And I want to have Bitcoin grenades exploding and all over the world. And I want this to work. And I want it to work this week. That's what I want.
That's what we want, and that's why we're here. And I'll read you another thing, just the headline here, just to juxtapose and show you, maybe if they look at themselves and maybe reflect a little bit more on themselves, they might see that the shortcomings are in themselves, and perhaps they're projecting